Ever get that feeling like the law has its own secret language? We're going to decode one of those tricky legal terms today, one you might think you know. But stick with us. There's a lot more to it than meets the eye. Assault. And to help us break it all down, we've got a legal pro in the house, ready to dive into the nitty-gritty of what actually makes an action assault in the eyes of the law.
Absolutely. It's a really interesting area of law, where like perception and a person's intent, they become really important.
Perception and intent, those are key. Okay, so before we get into any crazy court cases, let's start basic. What is assault, legally speaking? What are the elements that make something actually count as assault?
So legally speaking, assault isn't about if someone actually gets hurt physically. It's more about the threat, that possibility of harm. There are three main things we look for: an intentional act, some kind of real threat or use of force, and whether or not a reasonable person would think, okay, something bad's about to go down.
Okay, unpack that a little for me. Deliberate act, meaning it can't be an accident.
Exactly, yeah. We're talking about intentional decisions here. If you're just walking down the street and you bump into someone, that's not assault. But if you purposefully shove someone, that's when it starts to change.
Intent is everything. All right, what about that second part? Credible threat. Does that have to be literally someone's fist coming at you, or can it be
Yeah.
more subtle?
It doesn't have to be contact, that's for sure. Even actions that give that very real fear of harm, those count. Just picture it, someone coming at you full speed, that look in their eye, even if they don't touch you, that could be enough right there.
So it's about how an average Joe would see the situation.
Right.
Not just if someone is, feeling scared, but if that fear makes sense given what's happening.
That's it. You got it. That's the third ingredient, that reasonableness factor.
Hmm?
Would a reasonable person in that exact situation truly believe that they were about to be harmed? And this is where things get really interesting, because it all depends on context. It's not about someone being a wimp or anything. It's about if their fear is actually justified, given the situation.
Okay, I'm starting to see how subjective this can get. What one person finds threatening, someone else might not even bat an eye at.
You're telling me. And to give you an example, there's this case, Beach v. Hancock. So we've got a man pointing a gun at another person. Sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, I'd say. Sounds like assault to me.
Here's the catch, though. The gun wasn't loaded.
Wait, what? You mean to tell me pointing a gun, even an unloaded one, can be considered assault, even if they never fire it?
You got it. Because, you see, the law, it focuses on that perceived threat. The victim, they had no way of knowing the gun wasn't loaded, so in that moment, their fear was totally reasonable. It shows you, really, how important that idea of reasonable fear is. It's not about if they could have actually hurt the person, but if a normal person would feel threatened in that moment.
Makes you wonder about that saying. What is it? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. We've talked about physical stuff, but what about just words? Can just words be enough to be considered assault legally?
Oh, that's a great question. And like a lot of stuff in law, the answer is it depends. Words alone, they might not always be enough, but they can definitely be part of creating a threatening situation, especially when you add in other things.
What kind of other things are we talking here?
Context, that's the big one. Your tone of voice, like the relationship between the people involved, any other actions happening, it all adds up to how threatening things seem. Like a shouting match between strangers, totally different vibe than those same words being yelled in a dark alley. Or even worse, whispered by someone has a history of violence.
So same words, totally different meaning depending on the situation and who's involved.
Exactly. Perfect example, the case of Brooker v. Silverthorne. A man, he makes some pretty nasty threats to a telephone operator over the phone, saying he's going to hurt her.
Over the phone. That's ballsy. So did that count as assault?
This might surprise you, but no, the court said it wasn't assault. The words were bad, sure, but the key here was distance. The threat, it didn't have that immediacy because it was over the phone.
So even a direct threat, if it seems like the person can't act on it immediately, might not be assault?
You got it. Comes back to that reasonableness. In that situation, the threat, yeah, it's scary, but it doesn't mean a normal person would believe they were about to get hurt right then. But now, contrast that with Vetter v. Morgan. This time, a woman's alone in her car. Some guys pull up next to her. They're yelling threats, making aggressive motions, even shaking their car.
Okay, yeah, now that sounds terrifying. Even if they weren't touching her, stuck in her car like that, those words plus those actions, yeah, I can see how that'd make someone feel trapped.
Exactly, and the court agreed. They said those words, the actions, plus being trapped in the car, all that created a situation where any reasonable person would be afraid for their safety.
It's like the car becomes this pressure cooker, you know? Those words in that situation, they become more than just words. They're part of that feeling of danger.
Absolutely. And that's why this case is so important. It shows how fast things can go from 0 to 60, how words plus actions in a tense situation can be a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Way different than the phone call where the distance meant the threat didn't feel as real.
It's really interesting how the law tries to figure out those subtle differences between, like, a heated argument and a real threat, the kind you need the law to step in for. Really makes you think about context.
You said it. And it reminds us all to be careful what we say and do, even stuff that seems harmless, especially when emotions are running high. You never know how someone else is going to interpret things.
Yeah, it really makes you stop and think before you let things get out of hand. So before we wrap up this deep dive on assault, let's, like, sum things up for everyone listening. What are the big takeaways you want to leave folks with?
Well, first things first. Got to remember, assault isn't always about, actual violence, punches being thrown, that kind of thing. It's about that possibility, that fear that someone might be about to be harmed, and how real that fear is.
Right, it's not just what went down, it's how a reasonable person would have reacted in that moment,
Right.
taking everything into account.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like we saw from those cases, those little details, they matter. Context, who these people are to each other, how they're saying it, any other actions, all those things add up to whether it's considered a real threat or not.
It's like piecing together a puzzle, huh? Each little piece adds up to the big picture of, okay, is this assault or not?
That's a great way to put it. And it's exactly why these cases can be so tough. There's a lot of gray area, which is why understanding those little differences is so important.
You know what's got me thinking? We've talked about, like, in-person stuff, scary phone calls, even being trapped in your car, but what about online? All this cyberbullying, online threats, all those virtual spaces where it's easy to blur the lines. How does the law even begin to handle assault in that world?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the big question legal experts are trying to figure out right now. Like, what does imminent danger even mean when you're talking about something online? Or that reasonable fear we talked about. How do you measure that when you're dealing with, avatars and online personas and all that? Those are the questions that are going to shape how assault laws change and adapt as technology does.
It's like we need a whole new law dictionary for the internet age. Right?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to be fascinating to see how these ideas change and evolve as we go further into this online world.
Gives you a lot to think about, that's for sure. So as we're all navigating this crazy digital world, it's on all of us to, do our research, be aware of how we're acting online, and think about how these laws might need to change to keep up with the times. Until next time, keep those legal dictionaries handy and stay curious.